The cold air of the station hit her face like a quiet slap, sharp and unapologetic, as she stepped onto the empty platform. It was past midnight, the last train supposed to leave 20 minutes ago, but the message board flickered out the only announcement she feared to read: canceled. She stood there for a moment, the baby pressed against her chest, his small body heavy with the pure, untroubled sleep of someone who trusted the world without knowing its indifference. The mother's arms ached, her shoulders pulled down by the weight she had carried all day, not just the baby, but the grocery bags she never could afford to fill, the paperwork rejected at the housing office, the long walk across town after the bus driver waved her off because she was 30 cents short. Her feet throbbed inside cheap, too thin shoes, the soles worn smooth from walking places no one wanted to go. But none of that compared to the cold realization now tightening around her chest, squeezing the last breath of hope out of her. The train home was gone, and so was every place to go. The benches were already claimed, scattered with old newspapers, and the curled-up shapes of strangers lost to their own exhaustion. A janitor pushed his mop without looking at her, the wet trail on the floor gleaming under the artificial lights. The baby stirred slightly in his sleep, a soft whimper pressed against her skin. She kissed the top of his head, inhaling the faint scent of soap and milk, and pressed his body closer, her own coat thin and useless against the creeping chill. She looked around, eyes darting toward a small cafe near the ticket hall, its lights dimmed, chairs stacked on tables, locked. Another corner, near the restrooms, where a security guard leaned against the wall, face lit by his phone, headphones in his ears. For a moment, she thought of approaching, maybe asking if there was a waiting room, a spot where she could sit safely until morning, but the memory of past refusals froze her feet to the floor. She had heard it too many times, soft or sharp, but always final. "Sorry, ma'am, not allowed. Not my problem, not here." Her back found the wall. She slid down slightly, knees bent, until the baby shifted again, and she felt his head droop in a way that sent a surge of panic through her chest. No, she couldn't sit. If she sat, she'd fall asleep. If she fell asleep, she'd let go, and there was no one here to catch them. She straightened, pressing her shoulders into the cold concrete, bracing herself as if the wall might hold her up. A flickering light overhead buzzed, casting a pale glow over the crumpled paper cup on the floor, over the tired faces drifting past, over the long stretch of night she still had to endure. Her stomach clenched, a deep, hollow, twisting ache that had been growing since noon, but she ignored it. Hunger could wait, exhaustion could wait. Everything could wait except him. She rocked gently on her feet, her arms tightening, humming a soundless tune that only her son could hear. The hours had been unkind to her long before this night, before the train, before the station. There had been a time, not so long ago, when she believed she could outrun them, taking extra shifts, skipping meals, borrowing against borrowed time. But life had a way of collecting its debts, one small failure at a time, until all that remained was a woman standing in the middle of nowhere with nothing but her child and the crushing knowledge that nobody was coming to help. She glanced again at the message board, half hoping it might flicker back to life, announce a miracle, a delayed train, a rescue. But the letters stayed still, canceled, final, a sentence without appeal. Her eyes burned, not just from the sleeplessness, but from the stubborn tears she refused to let fall. Crying was dangerous. Crying would crack the thin shell of control she had left, and once it shattered, she feared she would never pull herself back together. So she blinked hard, shifted the baby slightly, and whispered against his soft cheek, "We'll be okay, sweetheart, just a little longer." He didn't stir, his tiny mouth open in a dream, his fingers curled into the fabric of her coat, as if he too knew to hold on. She closed her eyes for a moment, not to rest, but to steady herself. The night stretched ahead, long and cold and merciless, But she was still standing. She had no choice. She would stand until morning if she had to, because there was no one else, and for him, she would be enough. The night deepened, wrapping itself around the station like a damp blanket, smothering sound, swallowing warmth. The mother shifted her weight from one foot to the other, feeling the sharp pulse of pain shoot up her calves. Her back scraped against the rough wall, her arms numb from holding the child so long that they barely registered as part of her anymore. The baby murmured, his breath hitching as he stirred, a thin whimper of hunger slipping from his lips before he settled again. She kissed his forehead with cracked, dry lips, whispering soft apologies that floated away unheard in the cavernous space around them. The minutes dragged heavy and slow, and with each tick of the distant clock, her heart sank deeper into the cold pit of knowing she was utterly alone. She saw the security guard again, crossing the far side of the station, his badge gleaming under the flickering lights. Summoning what little courage she had left, she stepped away from the wall, feeling her knees tremble beneath her, and called out, her voice barely more than a hoarse whisper. "Excuse me, please, is there somewhere warm I can wait with my baby?" The guard paused, pulling out one earbud, his face lined with the fatigue of someone long past sympathy. "Sorry, ma'am, not allowed. The cafe's closed. There's nothing here." His voice was flat, rehearsed, practiced in the art of turning people away. She nodded numbly, murmured, "Thank you," because she no longer had the strength to fight, and turned back toward her corner, swallowing the sting of rejection that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. A woman swept past, the sharp click of high heels echoing through the station, her perfume cutting briefly through the stale air. The mother raised a trembling hand, desperate enough to risk humiliation. "Please, just for a minute, somewhere safe for him." The woman's eyes flicked toward her, then quickly away, the pace of her steps never faltering. A rush of footsteps, the metallic scrape of a suitcase, and she was gone, leaving behind only the faint trace of expensive perfume that vanished almost as quickly as her chance for help. The mother lowered her hand slowly, fingers curling into a loose fist, and let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding. Another door closed, another silent refusal. The last few bars of battery on her phone blinked red, a cruel reminder that even the fragile thread connecting her to the outside world was fraying. She pressed the number of the woman who had promised her a couch for the night, the one in the next city, the one she was trying to reach. It rang once, twice, then the hollow voice of the voicemail, cheerful and distant. She hung up without leaving a message. She already knew no one was coming. She stared down at the darkened screen, the reflection of her face barely visible in the cracked glass, and felt the quiet crush of invisibility settle deeper into her chest. The baby woke. Fully now, his small face pinched in discomfort, his tiny fists rubbing at his eyes, his mouth rooting for comfort. She shifted him against her, her own stomach tightening in sympathy as his cries rose in the vast, empty space. She tried to hush him, rocking gently, murmuring the old songs her mother had once sung to her, songs that now tasted like ash on her tongue. Her coat was thin, and she folded it tighter around him, feeling his shivers through the worn fabric. Her own body burned with hunger, a gnawing ache she had learned to push aside. But seeing his hunger, hearing his cries, tore at something deeper, something primal that left her gasping for breath. She looked toward the vending machine across the room, the rows of snacks and bottled water glowing temptingly behind glass, but the empty space in her pocket told her all she needed to know. The hours crawled, each one marked by a fresh wave of exhaustion, each one a lesson in what it meant to be invisible. People passed through the station without seeing her, without hearing the quiet desperation stitched into every breath she took. Her arms were shaking now, the baby heavier with each passing minute, her legs trembling with the effort of remaining upright. And still, she stood, because there was no other choice. Because even as the world closed its doors and turned away, she was the only door that would never close on him. She kissed the baby's damp forehead, feeling the faint trace of fever, and whispered again, "I'm sorry, baby. I'm so sorry." The words were thin, breaking at the edges, but they were all she had left to offer. The station seemed to exist outside of time now, suspended in a frozen moment where nothing moved except the sweep of the second hand across the distant clock face. The mother's legs ached with a deep grinding pain that pulsed from her knees up into her hips, a silent scream running through her bones. She shifted her weight, flexing one foot, then the other, but the relief was only momentary, each adjustment sending a sharp reminder that her body was beginning to fail her. The baby slept against her chest, his small fingers tangled in the thin fabric of her coat, his breath warm on her skin. His tiny body was the only thing anchoring her to the world, the only reason she fought back the irresistible pull of sleep that threatened to drag her under. Her eyes drifted closed for a moment, just a flicker, just the weight of exhaustion pressing down, but the sudden lurch forward of her body snapped her awake in panic. She caught herself against the wall, the baby pressed tightly in her arms, her heart hammering in her chest. No, she could not fall. She could not let go. The thought of his small body slipping from her arms to the cold, hard ground sent a surge of adrenaline through her that chased away the fog of sleep, at least for now. She clenched her jaw, forcing her eyes open, focusing on the chipped paint of the opposite wall, on the dull reflection of the overhead lights on the tiled floor, on anything that would hold her in the present moment. Sleep was the enemy now. Sleep was the thin line between survival and failure. The night deepened its grip, and the station emptied further, leaving behind only the silent, scattered remains of travelers who had long since disappeared into taxis, buses, warm beds. The cleaning crew passed by without a glance, their mops leaving streaks of water that glistened under the harsh lighting before fading into dull smudges. Somewhere in the distance, a vending machine hummed softly, the only sound besides the faint shuffle of her shoes on the floor. She hummed a song under her breath, an old lullaby, the words blurred by time and exhaustion, but the melody steady enough to soothe the restless stirring of the child in her arms. She rocked slightly back and forth, the motion automatic, the kind of muscle memory that came only from long nights spent comforting a baby who had no idea how much his mother carried on her shoulders. Her mind drifted in and out of daydreams, images rising unbidden. A soft bed, clean sheets, a quiet room filled with morning light, the smell of warm food drifting from a nearby kitchen. She imagined laying the baby down in a crib, watching his chest rise and fall in peaceful sleep, brushing his hair back from his forehead without the weight of fear pressing down on her. But the dream dissolved the moment her knees buckled slightly, and she was forced to shake herself awake again, biting the inside of her cheek, feeling the sharp sting of skin breaking as a way to tether herself back to consciousness. She leaned harder into the wall, every muscle screaming for rest, every thought narrowed to the single, desperate determination to stay upright just a little longer. The baby let out a soft cry, the kind that spoke not of pain but of discomfort, a tiny protest against the cold seeping into their skin, the hunger gnawing at his small stomach. She murmured to him, adjusting the coat around his body, pressing his face into the curve of her neck. "I know, baby, I know. Just hold on. Just a little more." Her voice cracked on the last word, but the baby settled, lulled by the familiarity of her scent, the rhythm of her breath, the beat of her heart, a metronome of love in a world that had otherwise gone silent. She watched the horizon beyond. The platform edge, the inky black sky stretched out above the tracks, waiting for the first faint hint of dawn. But the darkness remained unbroken, and with it came the creeping doubt that morning would ever come. Still, she held on, because to fall asleep was to fall apart, because to give in was to let go of the only thing that mattered. She thought of all the small, unremarkable ways she had survived before this night. The borrowed meals, the patchwork jobs, the quiet endurance of being unseen. And she realized that this, too, was just another kind of survival. And so, with trembling legs and burning arms, she stood, for as long as it took, for as long as he needed her. By the time the station clock struck 4, the mother had stopped looking at it. Time no longer mattered. What mattered was that her knees were buckling with each passing minute, that her fingers had gone stiff around the baby's body, that her head was dipping lower and lower, jerking up only when the instinctive surge of panic rushed through her chest. Her mouth was dry, the skin at the corners cracked and stinging, her throat raw from murmuring comfort through the night. The baby had slipped into a restless sleep, his tiny hands twitching, his forehead damp, with sweat under her touch. She felt it even through the haze of exhaustion, the subtle rise in his temperature, the worrying flush in his cheeks, and a fresh wave of helplessness swept through her, heavier than anything her body could carry. She tried to shift him to the other side to give her arms a moment of reprieve, but the muscles refused to cooperate. A violent tremor rippled through her shoulders, the kind that comes when the body has run out of reserves, when there is no food left in the stomach, no energy left to summon. She sank briefly to her knees, pressing her back against the wall, gasping at the sudden rush of dizziness that engulfed her for a moment, just a moment. She let her head fall forward, her chin resting on the baby's soft crown, her eyelids fluttering closed, and the cold floor beneath her knees felt like an anchor, holding her down, pulling her under. A distant sound, the shuffle of footsteps or the squeak of a mop, tugged at the edge of her awareness, but her body no longer had the strength to respond. The baby whimpered, twisting slightly, a small cough rattling in his chest, and the mother's eyes snapped open. A thin, sharp thread of terror shot through her, cutting through the fog of sleep. She forced herself up, every joint protesting, her legs trembling as if they no longer belonged to her. She clutched the baby tightly, whispering against his ear, her voice hoarse and broken. "Shh, sweetheart, it's okay, I've got you." But inside, she felt herself unraveling. She could hear her own breath, shallow and uneven, feel the cold sweat running down her back, the pounding of her heart like a drumbeat of desperation in her chest. Her vision blurred at the edges, black spots flickering across her sight, and the terrifying thought rose in her mind. What if I collapse right here, right now? What if I fall, and there's no one to catch us? She tried to focus on the smallest things, the feeling of his hair under her lips, the rise and fall of his chest, the soft weight of him against her body. These were the things that mattered, she told herself. Not the cold, not the hunger, not the numbness spreading through her arms. Just him, just this. But the body has its limits, and hers had been pushed past every boundary. Her legs gave another violent shudder, and for a split second she saw herself from the outside. A woman swaying on her feet. A baby clutched tightly in her arms, the picture of collapse frozen in time. And yet, somehow, she remained upright, staggering slightly, her shoulder hitting the wall, her breath coming in ragged bursts. She let out a soft, choking sound, somewhere between a sob and a laugh, the absurdity of it all washing over her in a dizzying wave. How had it come to this? How had life narrowed to this single, brutal moment of endurance? Outside the station, the first hint of dawn began to creep into the sky, a faint silver line against the deep blue of night. But inside, the lights remained harsh and cold, the air heavy with the scent of disinfectant and wet concrete. She closed her eyes for a moment, just to feel the coolness of the wall against her forehead, just to pretend she was somewhere else, a home, a room, a place where she could lay him down and let her body break in peace. But there was no peace. Here, only the relentless demand to keep standing, to keep holding on, to keep being everything this child needed in a world that had nothing left to give. When the station doors opened at the far end, when the early shift workers began to trickle in, she barely registered them. All she felt was the ground shifting under her feet, the desperate effort it took to stay upright, the sharp sting of tears that finally, silently, slipped down her cheeks. She whispered to her baby once more, her voice barely audible, "We're almost there, baby, almost there." And in that quiet, broken promise, she gave herself one more reason to keep going, even as her body screamed for rest. Even as the night finally began to give way to morning, the first thin streaks of daylight filtered through the grimy windows above the platform, casting a pale, washed-out light that softened the edges of the harsh steel and concrete around her. The mother barely noticed. Her legs were locked in place, trembling uncontrollably, her arms cramped around the baby whose feverish skin was now a slow-burning alarm against her chest. Her head drooped, chin resting on his hair, and her breath came in short, uneven gasps. Each inhale an act of defiance against the collapse her body so desperately craved. Around her, the station was beginning to stir with the quiet murmur of morning, the echo of shoes on tile, the low voices of workers arriving for the day, the distant metallic clatter of rolling gates lifted and locks turned. But inside the cocoon of her exhaustion, it was all a blur, a world half heard, half seen, beyond her reach. She felt herself sway again, her shoulder brushing hard against the wall, the sudden jolt sending a surge of panic through her chest. Her eyes snapped open, glassy and red-rimmed, and her arms tightened instinctively around the baby. He shifted, slightly, letting out a soft cough, a fragile sound that cut through the thick fog of her exhaustion and pierced her heart with fresh urgency. She blinked rapidly, forcing herself back into the present, shaking her head as if to ward off the dark edges crowding her vision. Not yet. She could not fall yet. Her entire body was trembling, her muscles locking and unlocking without rhythm, the tremors of a body long past its limit. But still, she clung to him, because letting go was not an option. Letting go was not something she would allow herself to even imagine. A movement to her left stirred something faint and flickering inside her awareness. She turned her head slightly, her stiff neck protesting, and saw a young man in a station uniform approaching, his brow creased in a mix of confusion and concern. For a moment she could not process what he was, only that he was there, solid and real, breaking through the haze of her isolation. He paused a few steps away, assessing the scene, the woman with sagging shoulders, the child clutched tightly in her arms, the red eyes, the grayish pallor of exhaustion that clung to her skin. Without a word, without asking questions or delivering instructions, he walked back through the gate and returned moments later with something that shimmered in her blurred vision, a paper cup steaming faintly in the cold air and a folding chair dragged along the ground. The sound of the chair scraping the floor should have startled her, but her body was too far gone to react. He set it down beside her and held out the cup, his face open, unguarded, quietly human in a way she had not encountered all night. For the first time in hours, she let herself exhale. Not a full breath, not a release of all the grief and exhaustion knotted inside her, but the smallest crack in the wall she had built around herself. She lowered herself onto the chair, her knees nearly buckling beneath her, her arms still locked tight around the baby. The chair creaked softly under her weight. The baby murmured faintly in his sleep, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt the ground steady beneath her feet. Her eyes filled before she could stop them. Silent tears traced down her cheeks, not loud or gasping, but quiet, like rain slipping down a window pane, unnoticed until the light catches it just right. She looked at the man, tried to summon words, but all that came was a raw whisper of a thank you, barely audible. He gave a small nod, not expecting anything in return, and stepped back, letting her be. She pressed her lips to the baby's damp forehead, closing her eyes, feeling the deep pull of sleep threaten to claim her now that she had finally sat down. She fought it for a moment, long enough to adjust the baby's position, to pull the thin coat tighter around him, to check that his tiny breath still ticked softly against her skin. Only then did she allow her eyes to close, her body folding in on itself, cradling the child with the last scraps of strength she had. The station continued to awaken around them, indifferent and alive, the sounds of mourning rising in volume and speed. But in that small corner, tucked against a wall where a mother had stood her silent vigil through the endless night, time paused. There were no announcements, no applause, no crowd gathered to witness her survival. Only the quiet weight of sacrifice, the invisible kind, the kind that passes unnoticed in a world too busy to look. And as the sun crept higher and the baby let out a tiny sigh, curling deeper into the hollow of her arms, the mother sat motionless, no longer holding back the collapse, no longer fighting the gravity of exhaustion. For this moment, she had done enough. For this moment, they were safe.